following program on Ada Derana 24 is classified for general audience. It is intended for all ages. It contains little or no violence, no strong language, and little or no sexual dialogue or situations. The following program contains opinions of the participants and does not reflect the views and beliefs of the Derana Media Network. The network believes in a safe space for all ideas to be expressed and on its duty to create such a platform for free speech. Viewer discretion is strictly advised. For a real view, real opinion, and for an honest conversation, it's time to Get Real with Mahieash Johnney. Tonight, coming to you from Studio 24 in Colombo.
A very warm welcome, everyone, to another episode of Get Real, where we give you real views, real opinions, and we have an honest conversation about whatever the topic that we are talking about. Tonight, our topic is Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka's economy. There is no other person I go for economic advice and actually to speak and get clarity about the economy other than Dr. Kenneth De Silva, global business cycle economist, who have been very much following a lot of events that is occurring. One of the reasons that I come to you, Doctor, and welcome to the show once again.
Thank you.
Is basically because of the simple fact that you tell a different story than the rest of the whole the clan of think tanks that exist, and that is very valuable because there's no point in going with the flow. Like one of the proverbs that I've actually heard says, only dead fish goes with the flow. So we are not a country that is dead, but in debt. So welcome to the program. The first question that I have for you before we get into all the nitty-gritties is, what is the health of our economy at this moment? We have a new government. We have a new parliament, we have a new finance minister, we have a new deputy finance minister, economic development minister, and all those kinds of things are occurring. We are heading for a budget very soon. In a situation like that, or what we've thus far seen, this is my personal opinion, is a continuation of the Ranil Wickremesinghe IMF plan. So even the president, when he went to the parliament and spoke about it, he said that we negotiated with the IMF to do A, B, C, D in order to give this to our people.
Right.
So that gives me the indication saying that apparently it is the IMF who's controlling our economy and it's not us, because we had to go and talk with them and get the permission from them in order to do whatever we want. So what is the health of our economy?
Yeah. So Mahieash, thanks. Great to be here once again, and thanks for your introduction. The economy, it's like this. When we started off started off a new government back in 2024, the signs were fairly promising. What they articulated on stage was, they're going back into production economy, domestic entrepreneurship, domestic capacity building. All these were fantastic notions that were projected out in the country. Now that is something that I think we and also the country and many of the voters supported and gave the government this unprecedented kind of power and authority to enact that particular policy framework. Now the reality is slightly different. Reality is actually now kicking home, because now we find ourselves as a country, all the promises made cannot be implemented verbatim as explained during the election. Now that's creating a friction, and that's creating more issues for the economy. If you look at the real sector, the numbers are not great. If you look at GDP in 2023, 2024, numbers are not great. In fact, we are worse off than what we were in 2018. For simple example, our real GDP was about $95 billion in 2018.
But The finance ministry, along with the finance minister, says that the last quarter we managed to get a surplus.
Yeah, so the GDP contracted. So it contracted to a significant level. It fell down to about $80 billion from 95 to 80. So that low base has helped us to gain back. What I'm trying to explain here is how we have still not even reached 2018 levels.
Okay.
So 95 billion was our total economy. If you take 95 billion is the total revenue that we made in that year. Simple as that. So your top line GDP is always your revenue number. So our revenue as a nation has declined from what it was. So it's gradually picking up, but that's not a really thing that we could be proud of, because we are still far behind the numbers of 2018, including per capita. That means the disposable income and the incomes that are distributed to the people on average, not that everyone does get it, but that number also is lower. So when you ask the question, is it better off or worse off, we have to look at the numbers and say the economy is still not up to its peak where it was in 2018, and that's the aspirational value that was projected by this government, and I think that's something that we are looking forward to seeing being implemented. Now we spoke about the budget that's coming up. The budget is actually clad in iron gloves, because the IMF framework, austerity framework, is on the rails and you can't derail it. And I think even the government has alluded to that fact, saying that, look, we are talking with the IMF, we are trying to do this, that and the other to give us some fiscal space. Now we don't have fiscal space, right? Because if you look at the numbers, we are still running a fiscal deficit. Even though we are saying we'll end up with a primary surplus. Primary surplus is not a something that we could, be happy about. I mean, yes, it's in the sense that your income less your expenses minus the interesting expenses will give you that primary surplus. But you're actually putting the country at greater peril, because public expenditure is curtailed now. Public expenditure, capital expenditure is going to be curtailed. The government has said that they are going to increase public expenditure, capital expenditure, but I mean, I'm just concerned as to from where that space will be retrieved, because you can't spend 1.3 trillion rupees, right, in terms of public expenditure in a framework where we are currently.
So you're not expecting a lot of drastic cuts on spending rates from this government's current, the upcoming budget?
Firstly, you have to trim expenditure. There is no two words about it, because we are committed to this IMF program, and even within the program, there are certain expenditure curtailments that we have to forego. Based on those performance criteria only is when the IMF tranche will be dispersed. There is one coming out in 2025 April, I believe, and then another one 2025 October. So those tranches are tagged to performance criteria, which means that the fiscal deficit has to be under check, and you can't deviate too much. You can make some small adjustments, but you can't deviate too much. So if you're going to cut expenditure, so two things.
So explain this to me, former finance minister, the current the current deputy finance minister, the current economic development minister. Everybody's telling that the economy is actually better. It is becoming better every single day. But if you ask the common man on the ground, how is it? Forget about the common man on the ground. Let's ask the people who are inside the studio and maybe in the control room, and ask how is their lives? Has it become better because of this particular numbers and everything that the government is saying that we are on a healthy path, we were recovered, we have done it? That does not tally with what is happening on the ground. So people are becoming more poorer, but the government is saying the country is recovering. So what is this two stories which we are not understanding? So
there is a disconnect in what you are actually saying, and that's the reality. The disconnect is there is a feel-good factor. The feel-good factor is you see remittances coming through, you see an increased number of tourism, so you see a whole heap of foreigners on the road. If you go to the south, if you go to Colombo, and you feel, compared to what it was 2 years ago, there is this improvement. So that's true. We can't deny it. Socially, and also numbers also point out to the same thing, because tourism has now yielded us about $3 billion. Private remittances is about $6.5 billion when it was about $1 billion in 2021. It collapsed. Tourism collapsed. The service sector, external service sector, the big key revenue bringer for the current account, collapsed completely. Now there is a recovery, and that recovery translates into cash into the general public because they are earning foreign currency. But at the same time, the cost of living has skyrocketed after the depreciation. So the depreciation offsets any value creation that has been there as a result of the increased income levels. So if you ask some of the foreigners, if you look at what they post also, you will find that many of them compare Sri Lanka to other countries and say it's relatively expensive. Expensive tourist destination, or that is a reality. And therefore we have to address that. So if the foreigners are saying that, I mean the common man obviously feels that tightness and the lack of any excess in disposable income as a concern, because day by day you find price adjustments, shortages, all that is building up into compression of the real incomes. So therefore, what you said is absolutely true. There is a feel-good factor, and the reality is that costs have gone up, and therefore disposable incomes are absolutely compressed, not only for people in tourism, but if you look at the financial sector, the banking sector employees, you talk to many of them, they will say the same thing. But there is a aspiration that's been built up because they think that things will get better, and that's why there is hope that with this budget, there will be some respite in terms of to give the people a breather and turn things around. Now that's a question that we have to ask ourselves, how are they going to do it? And I think you just mentioned saying that the finance minister has said there is going to be relief. Now that relief, I'm not too sure as to what kind of form it will take place in.
You had to cut something off in order to give something.
Yes, and also the point here is that, I mean, with all this IMF framework that is in place, we are still not out of the woods. If you look at the IMF projections, our GDP is going to grow only at 3% until 2030. So far below than our annual average, which during the war was around 4.5%. So our output gap is significant. Therefore, the economy is underperforming still.
That is the IMF's statement. So
IMF's projections, which the government has agreed to, right? And then mind you that the IMF GDP growth is tagged to the debt servicing component. So if the GDP rises above a certain level, our debt servicing or the coupons that are attached to the payment structure also increase. So if GDP remains below that level, we get the overall relief that the IMF is projecting.
In 2027, we are supposed to start servicing our debt. And that's when the real story will begin. And on top of it, now we are going to open our vehicle imports, and we are going to basically get back into normalization of things. That's why the president says that, for 2 years, 3 years, people didn't have vehicles, all that. But the gap between the really poor, the lowest level of income and the highest level continues to widen, not in just smaller rates, but in heavy rates. So people who are richer are getting richer every day. People who are poorer getting even poorer every day. For a simple example, if a person who's sweeping the streets, this is just being a generous number, is getting 1,000 rupees paid per day, that person would have actually brought some, food for like 2-3 people and had a meal, all 3 meals, and could have survived, not in a luxurious way, but in a sufficient way. But now, if you look at the numbers of a rice packet, a number of how many people to feed, can't even do that. You have to look at in one sense where one meal has to be skipped in order to survive. that is not a good figure for a country to say that we are growing or we are going through, all this transformation. Yes, we can see all the tourists in the country, but then again, I've been asking this question for quite some time. Are they the high spenders, or those guys who are coming to have pay a little bit of money and then get the best out of it and then run away, which means they're minor spenders. So that particular avenue. Now, with the vehicle imports being open, how is that going to impact before we even talk about debt servicing?
Right. So let me break this down into two parts. The first part is the vehicle importers. Second part is the tourism that you see on the ground and their effect on this. So let me take the last part, which is tourism. So we're expecting 2.5 million tourists this year. Now, people have forgotten how these tourists are going to be fed. When they're here, they have to eat and drink.
Yeah.
Now, all that contributes into aggregate demand, and that aggregate demand is not supplied through domestic means. Right? You said rice shortages. So we have got 22 million people, plus on top of that, another 2.5 million mouths to feed during the course of the year. And our production has not been geared to meet that. So if you look at the numbers in consumer imports, it's mind-blowing, right? From dairy milk to wheat to sugar to lentils to tin fish to dry fish to coconut oil, whole list of imported items which cater to not only locals but also the tourists. So that leakage is going to amplify. So until such time we have a really good domestic economic model where we can cater to that and retain some of those earnings, then only we will feel the benefits of that tourism inflow and as a national economy, because for the time being that's not happening. And for that to happen, it takes time, as we rightly spoke some time back, I think in 2020 when we spoke about production. It's the same kind of thought process that I still share, and I think we have not done anything great in that sense.
Good example which I want to get to, but before that I want to take a short commercial break. A lot more to discuss with regard to the health of our economy and also exactly where the country is heading in terms of economically. Yes, we've been told that everything is fine, everything is great, everything is becoming better, positive mindset is what the government is telling. But then again, manifesting good economy doesn't mean that it's really happening on the ground. You are the decider of that particular fact, because if you understand whether what you are getting is enough for you, and if the answer for that question is no, then you know whether the economy is going to be something better or not. But then again, like the doctor said, we have hope with regard to the current government, and that's around 6.8 million people's hopes. Let's hope and see that they actually get things right. I'm in conversation with Dr. Kenneth De Silva, global business cycle economist. This is Get Real with Derana. To Get Real, I'm in conversation with Dr. Kenneth De Silva, global business cycle economist. There were two parts to that question that I asked you prior to the break. One was about tourism, and the other one about the vehicle importation ban being lifted and how that's going to impact the economy. What about the vehicle import ban?
Yeah, so Mahieash, just to conclude on that first point which you're talking about, production, why it's so important, because I think people still underplay the necessity for production in this country, and I see people saying, we should import, comparative advantage doctrine, which is absolute rubbish. I have got no faith in that, and I don't believe in that to begin with, even though it's a key doctrine which has failed globally. The
neoliberal way of doing things. So I'll get to that. Let's talk about the vehicle.
So the production side of it, it's so important, because to do that, you need monetary and fiscal sovereignty. When I say sovereignty, you need to have control. In your earlier question, you said IMF is controlling, and are we going to see anything different in the budget? Now, that is a big issue because they are repealing the Strategic Development Projects Act, which gives you incentives to anything over $250 million, which was enacted in 2018 to attract foreign investment into Sri Lanka. That has to be repealed. So when you start to pull out legislation like that, what is the confidence that you can give domestic entrepreneurs that the taxation required to increase production will remain constant over the next 8 to 10 years? And what is the signal we are sending to foreign investors? People who are invested here, they will gain that facility. But to anyone coming new into this country, we are trying to attract foreign investment. We are actually pushing them away. When other countries like the US and etc.
I want to get into that US conversation, but before that, the vehicle import.
So imports, it's again the doctrine of the IMF. If you look at their core elements of any facility that they give, they have three major things which are detrimental. One is they say exchange rates must be market driven. They use various terms in this: market driven, unmanaged, etc. Then they tell you have to liberalize. And finally they tell you have to privatize all state-owned entities which are loss-making. Now, the exchange rate has a direct relationship to the state-owned enterprises because state-owned enterprises have borrowings in dollars. Their balance sheet has a mismatch. The balance sheet, now if you take Ceylon Petroleum has about $3 billion in terms of liabilities. Their revenues are in rupees. So when their exchange rate depreciates, they have to raise prices, or the treasury has to absorb it, right? So when it absorbs the losses, they come back and say state-owned enterprises are loss-making, therefore privatize it. And actually there is a paper put by the IMF to get USAID and IFC to work with the government to ensure that the state-owned enterprises are divested. Now, that is scary. Right? So the doctrine where they say, to open up the economy is part and parcel of the overall framework. But that's dangerous because we have seen the dangers of kind of a big bang opening up. I think the government also has taken some measures in terms of being careful. The revenue component doesn't really justify for us to have a big bang approach on the national balance sheet because you are looking at it from a one-dimensional point of view. If you take the total private sector and the public sector balance sheets, you will see the loss as a result of the slippage in exchange rates are significant, right? More than $5 billion of losses have accrued to this country because of the exchange rate movement. Plus, on top of that, debt servicing increases. And that is documented in the Central Bank Annual Report, Chapter 5, if you go and look at it. Now they don't publish Chapter 5, but if you go and look at historically Chapter 5 in the debt servicing, the fiscal side, you will see being mentioned that the debt servicing has increased as a result of exchange rate movements. But no one is monitoring that. No one talks about it because it's hidden. And then they club it and they say state-owned enterprises are loss-making. But the reality is you are locked because if Ceylon Petroleum increases its prices, the reverse of that in your balance sheet, you have to have an increased cost. Then you are uncompetitive. When you are not competitive, then how can you supply for production? Energy prices, transport prices, so logistics, everything increases, right?
And that is exactly why this government, who said before coming to power that I think they accused the then energy minister for taking some money or some stealing or something like that in the election platforms, and they said if we really calculate it, we can bring it down to 135 or something if we remove the taxes and all that. They gave figures which were very, very bold, and then the first the fluctuation of fuel prices was just 2 rupees, and the rest they had to keep it the same, because the reality is what you exactly just said. The fairy tale part was said during the election campaign, but when you come to really implement it, what you say makes a lot of sense, because if not, then the other what they promised should have happened. So what is the way out for a country like Sri Lanka? We've been talking about this manufacturing factor, and for that I want to bring this particular thing. The doctrine that apparently the neoliberal think tanks here in Sri Lanka, along with the rest of the people who are actually advising Sri Lanka how to run our country, is telling that we can't do manufacturing because you're a small country, you don't have the numbers, you don't, it doesn't make sense to you. Bring everything from abroad, repackage it, and then send it back and be a servicing kind of a economy. But for a very long time, we've been saying, no, we have to start manufacturing here. And that has to start whether in a smaller, minor scale, whatever said and done, we got to start doing that.
Sure.
In the future, we may have big numbers, but there should be a starting point at some particular moment. Got to identify certain key areas that we really need to start manufacturing and start doing, at least the ones who are manufacturing right now, at least let them thrive. So that kind of a talk. Now, the biggest advisor, the United States of America, now has a new administration. Donald J. Trump, the president. He comes in and he tells the rest of the nation and the world, look here, America first. Everything has to come back to America.
Yep.
We are now no longer giving anything for... Now they are becoming a manufacturing nation themselves. They have the numbers or whatever, whether it's an Apple phone or whether this thing, it has to be produced in America. If not, he's slapping tariffs. He's slapping tariffs left, right, and center. In a situation like that, that country is now following a manufacturing path, and the neoliberal think tanks in Sri Lanka is telling, let's forget about the manufacturing path and focus on some servicing BS.
Yeah, doesn't add up. Yeah, so you're right. I mean, for Sri Lanka to get into manufacturing, I think we don't need to do what other countries are doing. Like, if you look at our trade account, you can go line item by line item and see there are big ticket items which have above $100 million. Now, if you can internalize those savings, that will give you about a $2 billion net saving to the country. That $2 billion with our overall service exports and the rest of the remittances that we get in should be enough to have a current account surplus. But that is not the case, because if you look at what the IMF is projecting, we are still running a negative current account balance. So this twin deficit story still persists. We have been talking for it for ages, but we have got a current account deficit, we have got a fiscal deficit. So they're just focusing on a primary surplus, which is absolute rubbish and garbage, because you're still running a deficit in whichever shape or form you like to call it, because your debt servicing is so high. Debt servicing has actually doubled because of the depreciation plus the shock of... So when you depreciate the currency, there are multiple ripple effects in the economy. One is your whole manufacturing base collapses, construction, everything else, your cost base just rises up. We saw the apparel sector making a strong statement to that effect. Construction sector the same, tourism sector the same. So because we are heavily consumer item driven and intermediary inputs driven country which we have to import. So that shock comes in. On top of that, our inflation basket is highly sensitive to food. All these are imported food items that are in our inflation basket. So food and energy rises up. So inflation shock is there. And to adjust that, they use the interest rate, which is absolutely bollocks, right? So the people in this economy are getting a double whammy. Actually a triple whammy, because your exchange rate goes up, your earnings deplete, your cost of production goes out, your real incomes get impacted, and top of that, your debt servicing increases. And
also then you get taxed. Yeah, exactly.
So it's absolute crazy. So these think tanks that are out there have no coherent framework. They say, keep interest rates high. Now, which part of the world do we have interest rates at 20%? I mean,
not even America.
Look at our history. We have had double-digit interest rates from the 1990s. So if interest rates are high, there should be a current account surplus. It does not happen. So people don't look at the data. They don't come and talk facts, right? They just come and utter
That alludes to the simple fact that the financial literacy of our nation is absolutely, I think, in zero levels, despite the fact that we say that the literacy level is really high. Now, what can we learn from America, Doctor?
America is a classic example. America, when they started industrialization, I think in the early 18th century, when I think President Washington was in power, he brought a dynamic and a complete radical person into the administration. He was none other than Alexander Hamilton.
So
if you look at a US $10 note, you will probably find his bust, his face up there, because he was one of the great American transformists who shifted America into a production economy. So he used similar tools which Donald Trump is now using, because Donald Trump sees the necessity to get back to manufacturing because they are losing out to the rest of the world. And they are running, he categorically points out, saying that trade deficits are a huge issue, and they have got, I think, about a 33 trillion debt, which is far higher than their GDP.
And they say that that they cannot sustain it.
They cannot. So you have to have earnings brought back. He is a balance sheet manager, and he knows his balance sheet item, not like our people in this country. They know what the national balance sheet looks like, and he knows those variables that he has to pull and push to ensure that the overall external remittances and the external cash flows, because it's all about cash flows at the end of the day, are sufficient enough to meet his debt obligations and to claw back and strengthen his balance sheet. So that's what he's focusing on at a global scale, right? And he has been so clinical that he insisted on certain tariffs, and people are now shifting their production into the US. I mean, I was told even Canada, most of the manufacturing companies are pushing in
that
US.
Decision, because America is our biggest trade partner. That's going to impact us.
That can impact us, but the numbers are relatively small compared to other countries. If you look at the overall scheme of things, I think the biggest trade deficit is with China, and that's where they're trying to target, and then the rest of the European bloc. So Sri Lanka, we have, I think, a trade surplus of about $2.5 billion, which is relatively painless. But nevertheless, it will have some scrutiny, and there might be some legislation, so then our apparel industry can have some pushback in terms of the numbers. But the apparel industry also has roughly hovered around $5 billion in terms of gross value.
And they can't push that.
This is the thing, because we don't have our own brands, so we are still selling out to buyers who have their brands, who give us the design and the fabric and every other thing else, including all raw materials, is now sourced by the buyer. So the margins are wafer thin. So until and such time that we really become a truly independent, brand-oriented, manufacturing type of apparel hub, I think we are going to find it extremely difficult to get into Europe and into the US. But having said that, I think Asia is another classic example, because it's the Asian century that we are now, part of. It started back in 2020, and that's the time you saw all these trade wars also start to emerge. And that kind of reshapes the global dynamic, because if you look at the overall reserves also, Asia is funding the US, or Asia is loaning their reserves to the US to finance a deficit. So Asia is where the growing market is, where the young generation is, where the new innovations are, and where the wealth creation is there.
So in order to get that, we can't be this isolated nation sitting right at the bottom of the Indian Ocean and seated there all alone and talking about, us, and me. We have to get on board with that particular thinking, so that we can harness that particular the uptick that is going to come as forecast by many experts, that we have to ready ourselves in order to receive whatever that is going to come. We haven't even come close to even thinking in that part. So what are the avenues that we have to really start focusing on right now? not the tourism, not the apparel, not the usual culprits that we've been, basically throttling the neck in order to get a little bit of money out of it. But there are new avenues which we can go. What are and Sri Lanka can actually profit.
Yeah. So coming back to the overall portfolio structure and portfolio strategy, I think there is plenty of opportunity for Sri Lanka. With now artificial intelligence playing a key part in the decision-making process, that can really transform some of our internal operations that we do, and it can sharply reduce the cost that we have on board. So that's good. But having said that, remember that the rest of the world is also now part of this AI juggernaut, and there are streets ahead of us, including China. China's streets ahead of us, they have got autonomous cars. Huawei is making cars. So you can just see where it's gone to. So there is a different league there. But for Sri Lanka, our portfolio has to be revisited. We can't look at our traditional and look at our agriculture. There is food security is a key variable in today's geopolitical discourse. We are not paying any attention to it. You spoke about we are a small country, etc., and people keep saying all this, theoretical stuff that we can't look at manufacturing. See Netherlands, see Finland, see Switzerland, see Belgium. I mean, Belgium is the biggest exporter of chocolates in the world. They don't have sugar, they don't have cocoa, they don't have, so they are still exporting.
And the best joke is, I think it is the Netherlands. It is the Netherlands. One of their exports is tulips.
Yeah.
Flowers. Yeah. So basically, I think one of the best tulips are coming from Netherlands.
And second largest agri-exporter to the world after the US.
Exactly.
And no one realizes that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just euro, tulips.
100 billion euro annually.
Exactly.
So we have always put ourselves really low down the capability list. We undermine our own people. We still think that foreigners are the best thing that happened to Sri Lanka. And we embrace that mindset. Everywhere it's the same, right? It can be a guy who just puts on a suit and comes in for a discussion, but we are scared to question the rationale and the policies that this guy brings. I mean, we are just, we just take it as it is. We don't have the wherewithal to, share our opinions. We have to.
Yeah.
We have to. I mean, as a country which has a rich history. 2005
rich history is absolutely useless now, no? Isn't it?
I mean, it's a shame because we were on par with other civilizations during that period, right? If you look at our engineering capacity, our technology that we use, so we are not a country or a civilization that can be discounted that easily. It's just that we have within our own country we feel a sense of a victory when we undermine our own people.
Oh yeah.
So that's the biggest issue we face in this country. Otherwise, there are enough of smart people.
That whole concept of local solutions doesn't go down.
It's frowned upon.
That doesn't go very well with the neoliberal.
You have to have a cut and paste type of approach, which is applauded.
Let's take a short commercial break. A little bit more to discuss with Dr. Kenneth De Silva, global business cycle economist. You're watching Get Real. We'll be right back. Conversation with global business cycle economist Dr. Kenneth De Silva. Right now, Trump is basically giving shock after shock to the rest of the world with regard to their economies because of his literal Trump first, America first policy is basically, which is very popular within the country and very unpopular outside of the country, but he's doing what he has been voted in for. Yeah. He said ABCD, I'm going to do this, and he on day one, I think more than closer to 200 executive orders were signed. That was in the history, the first president to do that, reversing all the negative ones that Biden administration has been doing thus far. And everything he promised. And he's not shying away. He's not like, okay, let's negotiate, let's see how things are going to happen. None of that. He is doing what he said he's going to do. He doesn't care about what happens to the rest of the world. He only cares about what happens to America, which is in a way fair because he's the president of the United States of America, so take care of America. Give an example. The example is first your people, then the rest. So in Sri Lanka and the rest of the world, these kinds of Trump decisions, how is that going to impact? Because China, Canada, Mexico, even the BRICS nations, Russia, all these people are in a trade war. I think the trade war has started completely. The only person who's not has been pulled into it is India. So that in that dynamic, how are things going to happen? You know, what's going to happen?
So if you analyze what President Trump is saying, I mean, it's very interesting and very fascinating to look at and read between the lines, so to speak, and look at the numbers. So when you analyze that, as I told you, he's going back to the era of Alexander Hamilton. He realizes that the US has no chance in the next century because China has already secured that century from supply side to all the minerals. 80% of the manufacturing minerals needed in the world is held by China. So US has lost out there. On the energy front, US is not secure as well. He knows that is also out. So he has an itemized list that indicates how his production costs are going to be reduced or what is its disalignment with the rest of the world. Now he's taking those line items, each line item, and he's determining policy. That's the crux of it. So if he says drill baby drill, he is looking at energy security
prices,
because he knows to set AI even, you need to have cheap data centers which consumes a
lot of energy. Yeah.
So now he has got few investors to invest
Elon
in the
Musk
US.
is
Elon
also
Musk
there.
and I think a Japanese or South Korean investor to invest about $1 trillion over the next 3 years. Huge investment in the first few days that he took office, and it was headline news. So data centers are the future for the US and rest of the world because AI requires considerable amount of energy. So they are looking at decentralized methods of having AI, but currently a lot of data centers will be required because all the new laptops, the equipment, electronics, manufacturing equipment is all AI driven. Sensors, everything is AI driven. So that's going to be the future. And that's why I said the century for Asia started with the new technology. In the business cycle, we look at that. It's a 100-year cycle, which is a long cycle. The long cycle already started and it's in Asia's favor. Now, if US has to secure its future, and obviously you are concerned about that as president of the US, you have to act swiftly and fast because you have already lost market share. Tesla has lost market share, Apple has lost market share, all their production has lost market share, and they're in China. And many of the US companies are also in China, and also they are catering to the rest of the world, but the dividends that come into the US is not sufficient because they retain earnings in China because they want to reinvest because China's interest rates are low. Donald Trump says he wants low interest rates. He wants a stable currency. He wants to cut expenditure and bring back that investment into the US to manage domestic social welfare. He doesn't care about other people's welfare. Not that he doesn't care, he's trying to trim that. So if you look at those line items, that's what they're doing. So there is a lot of noise, but if you read through the noise, these are the key points that you can pick up. And I think that's a very smart move because once you start hitting, he pulled out from the
World Health Organization, USAID, all these things.
Climate agreements. This is not the first time the US pulled out. They have pulled out many other times, despite being the highest polluter in the world in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. US is ranked as one of the highest in the world. So despite all that, they're going back to fossil fuels. So what he's trying to do is to shift the power dynamic from this. right? So that the shift will happen, because if you are going to go into better technology and etc., you have to have
energy.
The energy. The energy is basically now data centers, industries, so you need all that to happen. And therefore, if you have energy security and low cost energy, which is pushing the rest of the world to do also, right? So you will have global inflation significant reduction. And actually the world is at a point where we are seeing a continuous decline in inflation. For the last 20 years, inflation has been on the downward trend. That is because cost of production has reduced. And cost of production is reduced because China is producing at a heavy, with a heavy output at a heavily subsidized rate. That's why from solar panels to cars to TVs to fridges has reduced drastically. In fact, if you look at what's happening in the rest of the world, economics can be put to shame.
Yeah. One of the things that countries like Switzerland did was, they didn't try to compete. They looked at the areas where they can harness when the rest of the world is actually going on a power struggle. They took a little bit of it and they brought it back, and then they started thriving. This is being very smart. Now, I think that is the approach Sri Lanka also can learn from. We can't get involved with all these global, wars that is occurring, whether it's a trade war, real war, whatever. We have to think smart in order to make sure that our economy grows. That's the key important factor. So Switzerland, what they did was, whether it's Swiss watches or basically having banks where you can, bring in your money and just invest, very unconventional ones, is what Switzerland is very much famous for. And they did that. They didn't want to manufacture cars or go on with this entire head-to-head fight with other nations. They slowly took something that they didn't, the rest of the world was not thinking about, and now they're thriving like one of the richest nations in the world. And their currency is also really strong. In a situation like that, how can Sri Lanka think smart? Everything is now coming towards Asia. Asia is becoming number one. And we are also right there, smack bang. We are good with India, we are good with China, we are good with the rest of the nations in Asia. How can we think smart?
So, fantastic question. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Asia, particularly in the big players like India and China, which you mentioned, which will drive the Asian economies and the wealth creation, lots of the companies within these two countries have now reached their cost maximization, because costs have increased as they go into new markets and etc. So they are also looking at shifting some of these into other parts of the world. The biggest beneficiary has been Vietnam, and now Philippines also. Vietnam, Philippines, Cambodia. There are still issues in terms of the political environment there, but Asia is benefiting from the fallouts of these manufacturing. So we have to be smart. We have to attract these, manufacturing businesses that have been offloaded by these countries and attract them with proper incentives. Now, once you do that, I mean, that's what China did earlier. They attracted the US and they ensured that the US disclosed all their manufacturing variables as part of the entry. Yeah. And then they mimicked it. Very simple, right? Yeah. But that has been smart. So China, within the shortest period of time in world history, pulled out more than 500 million people out of poverty, right? So it's a remarkable feat, and many economists don't talk about it. They did it with government support, government intervention, development banks, low cost credit, stable exchange rate.
Every single thing that the IMF is telling us not to do.
Absolutely. So each country has a different template. We must have our own template. What works for us must be done at any cost. If we are serious about increasing our per capita to $12,000 per person, manufacturing is the only way out. There is no other way. You rely on services. No sooner there is one simple shock, we saw what happens.
2019, 2020.
Bitter lessons.
2022.
Bitter lessons. Yeah. And still we don't seem to realize, and still we are putting all eggs in one basket, and people are applauding this particular approach when it's far from the truth. So it is really scary, and my personal view is that opportunity is there. We have to look at this opportunity now because we are not too late. Technology has changed. We are in a new business cycle where the start.
And in the tech sector in Sri Lanka is also very strong.
Very strong. You can attract. There is a whole heap of that's low-hanging fruit. In fact, the tech sector, right? I mean, we are saying $3 billion.
I think more.
I mean, that's a number that is insignificant. Now, you can't get that. $15 billion, I think, in 5 years or something like that. But that's if you don't have fiscal and monetary sovereignty, no one is going to come and set up here because people have to import.
I think the best example is the port city. Port city, nobody's touching it because we don't have that.
Yeah. So you're right. So Port City has an act, plus the Strategic Development Projects Act, SDP, which was enacted in 2021 or 2022. No, probably earlier than that. Anyway, that act is a very interesting act because it opens the avenues for investors, serious investors with a particular value of $250 million or above to come into this country.
But no one is coming.
But now they're trying to repeal that. So when investors come and you say that no, we're going to repeal this, I mean, who wants to come here when other countries and even the US is offering better terms? Because it's a competitive environment. We have to understand what is our competitive strength. If our people are the competitive strength and key variable, then we have to provide the infrastructure for investments to come into this country. We are talking investments, and we are actually strangling
getting
ourselves.
cashews from Dubai.
We are strangling ourselves on the other side. Say, no, you can't do this. You can't do that. We can't give you this. We can't give you that. So which investor wants to come and listen to that? And which investor wants to pay income tax of 30%? Which investor wants to pay import duties? Which investor wants to come and have, there is no ability to fund their working capital or their capex. You can't borrow dollars in the capital markets because now it's around 10-15%. Yeah. So you can't. So where is this so-called investment climate that we have been talking about? It's not there.
Indeed. Well, interesting times ahead. We hope that this government actually forego the IMF plan and rethink from zero and actually showcase, because they have the opportunity, whatever said and done, because they don't have the baggage of any previous administration. They're not, they don't have the allegiance to be, to this country, that country. They can be very much Sri Lanka focused, Sri Lanka first kind of attitude, and I hope the president actually takes a really strong direction towards that and learn a little bit from Donald Trump. And actually maybe ask Donald Trump to come here and invest a couple of hotels. That'll help us immensely. But then again, a lot more indeed to look out for. Dr. Kenneth De Silva, appreciate it every single time. It has always been a good discussion. Thank you very much for coming. Well, that's all the time we have for you tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back again next week, Friday, 7 p.m. with another episode of Get Real. See you then. Bye for now.